Call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 15 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy, and Ethics. Pursuant to Standing Order 1083H and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, December 13, 2021, the committee is resuming its study of the use and impact of facial recognition technology. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of November 25th, 2021. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Per the Director of the Board of Internal Economy, March 10th, 2022, those attending the meeting in person must wear a mask except for members who are at their place during proceedings. Just a few comments. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, so for witnesses participating maybe for the first time in this type of meeting, you do have the option for interpretation at the bottom of your screen. You can select either the floor mic of either language or to select French or English for translation. For those in the room, use the earpiece and select the desired channel. And just a reminder that comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, raise your hand to speak. For members on Zoom, use the raised hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order the best we can and appreciate your patience and understanding. All right, so I will welcome now all of our witnesses. We have 4 witnesses this morning. Dr. Rob Jenkins, Professor, University of York. Mr. Sanjay Khanna, Strategic Advisor and Foresight Expert. Ms. Angelina Wang, Computer Science Graduate Researcher, Princeton University. And Dr. Elizabeth Ann Watkins, Postdoctoral Research Associate, Princeton University. So we'll begin with Dr. Jenkins. You have 5 minutes for your opening statement. Go ahead, Dr. Jenkins.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Rob Jenkins. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of York in the UK, and I speak to the issue of face recognition from the perspective of cognitive science. I'd like to begin by talking about expectations of face recognition accuracy and how actual performance measures up to these expectations. Our expectations are mainly informed by our experience of face recognition in everyday life, and that experience can be highly misleading when it comes to security and forensic settings. Most of the time we spend looking at faces, we're looking at familiar faces, by which I mean the faces of people we know and have seen many times before, including friends, family, and colleagues. Humans are extremely good at identifying familiar faces. We recognize them effortlessly and accurately, even under poor viewing conditions and in poor quality images. The everyday success of face recognition in our social lives can lead us to overgeneralize and to assume that humans are good at recognizing faces generally. We are not. Applied face recognition, including witness testimony, security and surveillance, and forensic face matching, almost always involves unfamiliar faces, by which I mean the faces of people we do not know and have never seen before. Humans are surprisingly bad at identifying unfamiliar faces. This is a difficult task that generates many errors, even under excellent viewing conditions and with high quality images. That is the finding not only for randomly sampled members of the public, but also for trained professionals with many years' experience in the role, including passport officials and police staff. It is essential that we evaluate face recognition technology, or FRT, in the context of unfamiliar face recognition by humans. This is partly because the current face recognition infrastructure relies on unfamiliar face recognition by humans, making human performance a relevant comparison, and partly because, in practice, FRT is embedded in face recognition workflows that include human operators. Unfamiliar face recognition by humans, a process that is known to be error-prone, remains integral to automatic face recognition systems. To give one example, In many security and forensic applications of FRT, automated database search delivers a candidate list of potential matches. But the final face identity decisions are made by human operators who select faces from the candidate list and compare them to the search target. The UK Surveillance Camera Code of Practice states that the use of FRT, quote, should always involve human intervention before decisions are taken that affect an individual adversely, end quote. A similar principle of human oversight has been publicly adopted by the Australian federal government. Quote, decisions that serve to identify a person will never be made by technology alone, end quote. Human oversight provides important safeguards and a mechanism for accountability. However, it also imposes an upper limit on the accuracy that face recognition systems could achieve in principle. Face recognition technologies are not 100% accurate. But even if they were, human oversight bakes human error into the system. Human error is prevalent in these tasks, but there are ways to mitigate it. Deliberate efforts must be made to ensure that the humans involved in face recognition decisions are highly skilled, either by targeted recruitment or evidence-based training. Use of FRT in legal systems should be accompanied by transparent disclosure of the strengths, limitations, and operation of this technology. If FRT is to be adopted in forensic practice, new types of expert practitioners and researchers are needed to design, evaluate, oversee, and explain the resultant systems. Because these systems will incorporate human and AI decision-making, a range of expertise is required. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jenkins. And now, Mr. Canna, you have 5 minutes. You'll have to take yourself off of mute, Mr. Canna.
I'm very sorry. Mr. Chair, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you and the members. I will be speaking about facial recognition technology, the individual, digital society, and government. I am a consultant in the areas of strategic foresight, scenario planning, and global change, and I'm an adjunct professor in the Master of Public Policy and Digital Society program at McMaster University. A key foresight method that I use for planning for the future is scenario planning. As Canada navigates the most uncertainty it has faced since the start of the post-war period, scenario planning can play a role in helping legislators to inform resilient strategy and public policy. I see the following as important issues to address with facial recognition, which I will refer to as FRT. 1, people are being targeted by FRT without meaningful consent and/or in ways they do not understand. 2, societies that are increasingly unequal include populations and people who cannot advocate for their interests related to FRT's current or possible use. 3, legislators will always be behind the curve if they do not take the time to explore the plausible futures of digital society and the role of novel technologies such as FRT within them. I will speak to these concerns from the perspectives of the individual, of society, and of government. The individual. Our faces open doors to us and can lead to doors being closed on us. We experience biases across the spectrum from negative to positive and implicit to explicit based on how our faces are perceived and other factors related to our appearance. This fundamental reality shapes our lives. With an FRT-enabled world, what might it mean to be recognized by technical systems in which FRT is embedded? What might it mean for FRT to be combined with sentiment analysis to quickly identify feelings at vulnerable moments when a person might be swayed or impacted by commercial, social, or political manipulation? What might it mean for a person to be identified as a potential social, political, or public safety threat by FRT embedded into security robots? And what might it mean for a person to be targeted as a transactional opportunity or liability by FRT embedded into gambling or commercial services? Technologies associated with FRT, such as big data, machine learning, and artificial intelligence, amplify these potential risks and opportunities of FRT and other biometric technologies. While some individuals may welcome FRT, many are concerned about being targeted and monitored. In cases where rights are infringed, individuals may never know how or why. Companies may choose not to reveal the answers, and there may not be meaningful consent. In such cases, there will be no accessible remedies for individuals impacted by commercial, legal, or human rights breaches. Digital society. Canadian society faces unprecedented challenges. Rising social and racial inequality in our country has been worsened greatly by the pandemic. Canadians are experiencing chronic stress and declining physical and mental health. Social resilience is undermined by disinformation and misinformation. Canada is addressing new and threatening challenges to the post-war order. The climate crisis is a co-occurring threat multiplier. Despite these challenges, major technology companies are profiting from opportunities amidst the unprecedented risk, and so have gained additional leverage in relation to governments and our digital society. In this process, a few companies have accrued considerable power with trillion-dollar-plus valuations, large economic influence, and a lock on machine learning and artificial intelligence expertise. As I speak, technology leaders are imagining the next FRT use cases, including how FRT might be used more widely in business, government, and industry. Some tech companies are exploring threats and opportunities that would justify use cases that may be unlawful today, but could be viable in new circumstances, from a change in government to a shocking security event to changes in labor laws. Government. A society facing constant disruption has not proved a universally safe one for Canadians. The realities of harms and potential harms to individuals, risks and opportunities for business and government puts effective governance in the spotlight. At a time of unprecedented risk, parliamentarians have a responsibility to make sense of societal change and to comprehend plausible futures of FRT amidst the use of sophisticated surveillance systems in smarter cities, growing wealth and income inequality, threatened rights of children and marginalized communities. Creating effective law and policy related to FRT should involve due contemplation of plausible futures. I respect that for you as legislators, this is a challenging task, given the often short-term horizons of elected individuals and parties. But prospective thinking can complement the development of legislation to deal with novel and often unanticipated consequences of technologies as potent as FRT, which is inextricably linked with advances in computer vision, big data, human-computer interaction, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and robotics.
Okay.
Mr.
Canna, I'm sorry, I am going to have to,
Okay.
You're a little bit over time, and thank you for your opening statement.
Thank you.
Mr. Fergus?
Just because I just heard Mr. Canna while you were speaking just say it's his last paragraph. I was wondering if we could make the exception for that last paragraph.
If you can spit it out in about 15 seconds or less, then I'll do that.
I can't do
Okay.
that. A government responding to the now in this space will always remain behind the curve. Some technology companies and startups are betting that governments won't catch up. Legislators should take steps to correct this impression by instituting guardrails over longer horizons that strengthen Canadians' resilience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I do apologize to witnesses when periodically I have to cut you off, but we do have we are somewhat governed by the clock, and so my apologies. It probably will not be the last time I have to do that in this meeting. So if I may go now to Ms. Wang, please go ahead with your opening statement. Up to 5 minutes.
Hi, I'm Angelina Wang, a graduate researcher in the Computer Science Department at Princeton University. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I will give a brief overview of the technology behind facial recognition, as well as highlight some of what are, in my view, the most pertinent technical problems with this technology that should prevent it from being deployed. These days, different kinds of facial recognition tasks are generally accomplished by a model that has been trained using machine learning. What this means is that rather than any sort of hand-coded rules, such as that two people are more likely to be the same if they have the same colored eyes, the model is simply given a very large data set of faces with annotations and instructed to learn from it. These annotations include things like labels for which images are the same person and the location of the face in each image. These are typically collected through crowdsourcing on platforms like Amazon Mechanical Turk, what has been known to have homogeneous worker populations and unfavorable working conditions. The order of magnitude of these data sets is very large, with the minimum being around 10,000 images and the maximum going up to millions. These data sets of faces are frequently collected just by scraping images off of the internet from places like Flickr. The individuals whose faces are included in this data set generally do not know their images were used for such a purpose and may consider this to be a privacy violation. The model uses these massive data sets to automatically learn how to perform facial recognition tasks. It's worth noting here that there's also lots of pseudoscience on the other kinds of facial recognition tasks, such as gender prediction, emotion prediction, and even sexual orientation prediction and criminality prediction. There has been warranted backlash and criticism of this work because it's all about predicting attributes that are not visually discernible. In terms of what some might consider to be more legitimate use cases of facial recognition, these models have been shown over and over to have racial and gender biases. The most prominent work that brought this to light was by Joy Buolamwini and Timnit Gebru called Gender Shades. While it investigated gender prediction from faces, a task that should generally not be performed, it highlighted a vitally important flaw in these systems. What it did was showcase that hiding behind the high accuracies of the model were very different performance metrics across different demographic groups. In fact, the largest gap was 34.4% accuracy difference between darker skin tone female people and lighter skin toned male people. Many different deployed facial recognition models have been shown to perform worse on people of darker skin tones, such as multiple misidentifications of Black men in America, which have led to false arrests. There are solutions to these kinds of bias problems, such as collecting more diverse and inclusive data sets and performing disaggregated analyses to look at the accuracy rates across different demographic groups, rather than looking at one overall accuracy metric. However, the collection of these diverse data sets is self-exploitative of marginalized groups by violating their privacy to collect their biometric data. While these kinds of biases are theoretically surmountable with current technology, there are two big problems that the current science does not yet know how to address. These are the two problems of brittleness and interpretability. By brittleness, I mean that there are known ways that these facial recognition models can break down and allow bad actors to circumvent and trick the model. Adversarial attacks are one such method, where someone can manipulate the face presented to a model in a particular way, such that the model is no longer able to identify them, or even misidentify them as someone completely different. One body of work has shown how simply putting a pair of glasses that have been painted a specific way on a face can trick the model into thinking one person is someone entirely different. The next problem is one of interpretability. As I previously mentioned, these models learn their own sets of patterns and rules from the large data set they are given. Discovering the precise set of rules the model is using to make these decisions is extremely difficult, and even the engineer or researcher who built the model frequently cannot understand why it might perform certain classifications. This means that if someone is misclassified by a facial recognition model, there's no good way to contest this decision and inquire about why such a decision was made in order to get clarity. Models frequently rely on something called spurious correlations, which is when a model uses an unrelated correlation in the data to perform a classification. For example, medical diagnosis models may be relying on an image artifact of a particular X-ray machine to perform classification rather than the actual contents in the image. I believe it is dangerous to deploy models for which we have such a low understanding of its inner workings in such high-stakes settings as facial recognition. Some final considerations I think are worth noting include that facial recognition technologies are an incredibly cheap surveillance device to deploy, and that makes it very dangerous because of how quickly it can proliferate. Our faces are such a central part of our identities and generally do not change over time, so this kind of surveillance is very concerning. I have only presented a few technical objections to facial recognition technology, and taken as a whole with the many other criticisms, I believe that the enormous risks of facial recognition technology far outweigh any benefits that can be gained. Thank you.
Thank you. Now to Dr. Watkins for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you for the chance to speak today. My name is Elizabeth Ann Watkins, and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Information Technology Policy, as well as the Human-Computer Interaction Group at Princeton University, and an affiliate with the Data and Society Research Institute in New York. I'm here today in a personal capacity to express my concerns with the private industry use of facial verification on workers. These concerns have been informed by my research as a social scientist, studying the consequences of AI in labor contexts. My key concerns today are twofold. One, to raise awareness of a technology related to facial recognition, yet distinct in function, which is facial verification. And two, to urge this committee to consider how these technologies are integrated into socio-technical contexts. That is, the real world humans and scenarios forced to comply with these tools, and to consider how these integrations hold significant consequences for the privacy, security, and safety of people. First, I'll give a definition and description of facial verification. whereas facial recognition is one-to-end system, which means it both finds and identifies individuals from camera feeds, typically viewing large numbers of faces, usually without the knowledge of those individuals. Facial verification, on the other hand, while built on similar recognition technology, is distinct in how it's used. Facial verification is a one-to-one matching system, much more intimate and up close, where a person's face directly in front of a camera is matched to the face already associated with the device or digital account into which they're logging in. If the system can see your face and predict that it's a match to the face already associated with the device or account, then you're permitted to log in. If this match cannot be verified, then you'll remain locked out. If you use Face ID on an iPhone, for example, you've already used facial verification. Next, I'll focus on socio-technical context, talk about where this technology is being integrated, how, and by whom. My focus is on work. Facial verification is increasingly being used in work context, in particular gig work or precarious labor. In the US, Amazon delivery drivers, Uber drivers, and at-home healthcare workers are already being required in many states, in addition to countries around the world, to comply with facial verification in order to prove their identities and be allowed to work. This means that the person has to make sure that their face can be seen and matched to the photo associated with their account. Workers are typically required to do this not just once, but over and over again. The biases, failures, and intrinsic injustices of facial recognition have already been expressed to this committee. I'm here to urge this committee to also consider the harms resulting from facial verification's use in work. In my research, I've gathered data from workers describing a variety of harms. They're worried about how long their faces are being stored, where they're being stored, and with whom they're being shared. In some cases, workers are forced to take photos of themselves over and over again for the system to recognize them as a match. In other cases, they're erroneously forbidden from logging into their accounts because the system can't match them. And they have to spend time visiting customer service centers and then wait, sometimes hours, sometimes days, for human oversight to fix these errors. In other cases still, workers have described being forced to step out of their cars in dark parking lots and crouch in front of their headlights to get enough light for the system to see them. When facial verification breaks, workers are the ones who have to create and maintain the conditions for it to produce judgment. While the use of facial recognition by state-based agencies like police departments has been the subject of growing oversight, the use of facial verification in private industry and on workers has gone under-regulated. I implore this committee to allocate attention to these concerns and pursue methods to protect workers from the biases, failures, and critical safety threats of these tools, whether that's through biometric regulation, AI regulation, labor law, or some combination thereof. I second a recent witness, Cynthia Koo, in her statement that recognition technology cannot bear the legal and moral responsibility that humans are already abdicating to it over vulnerable people's lives. A moratorium is the only morally appropriate regulatory response. Until that end can be reached, accountability and transparency measures must be brought to bear, not only on these tools, but on company claims that they help protect against fraud and malicious actors. Regulatory intervention could require that companies release data supporting these claims for public scrutiny and require companies to perform algorithmic impact assessments, including consultation with marginalized groups to gain insight into how workers are being affected. Additional measures could require companies to provide workers with access to multiple forms of identity verification to ensure that people whose bodies or environments cannot be recognized by facial verification systems can still access their means of livelihood. At heart, these technologies provoke large questions around who gets to be safe, what safety ought to look like, and who carries the burden and liability of achieving that end. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for that opening statement. And now we'll move to questions and begin with Mr. Williams for 6 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for our witnesses attending today. This is very interesting. I'm going to start with Mr. Jenkins. And you've completed work regarding the accuracy of facial recognition by experts such as passport officers, and you've found a large amount of human error that exists. What are the error rates by humans versus machine learning software for facial recognition technology?
Thank you. Yes, it depends largely on the specifics of the task, but in a task in which passport staff who have been trained and have many years experience in the job are asked to compare live faces presented in front of them against photographed identity documents similar to passports. We typically see error rates of around 10%, meaning that for every 10 comparisons that are made, one of them is made erroneously. And I am talking about a decision whether there's a match or a mismatch between the photo and the live person. As for computer-based systems, we have very little understanding in how most of them operate in realistic conditions. Many of the test results that are reported by vendors are based on idealized situations in which image quality is reliably good and the conditions under which the match is being conducted are very good. And that ignores the noise and complexity of the real world. So we just don't know enough about that, in my view.
Okay, thank you. And when we compare to other methods of identification, so let's say fingerprinting, do you know of any data on that? What would the error rate be for fingerprints instead of using facial recognition?
Can't quote a figure, but there are reasons why fingerprint matching can be more reliable in certain circumstances. And one of the reasons is that facial appearance changes a lot according to lighting conditions and the distance from the face to the camera lens. Those particular problems are not present when it comes to matching fingerprints.
Okay, and errors made by humans and versus computers, are they the same errors or are they completely different? You've mentioned a few of them.
There are patterns of similarity, but there are also striking divergences between the errors that computers and humans make. Dr. Wang mentioned an example where simply adding glasses to someone, that wouldn't affect a human perceiver's view of who is there, but seemingly superficial changes like that can really throw some computer systems and lead to incorrect answers that are unexpected.
And you mentioned, FRT should always include human intervention. How does that decrease? Is it ever going to be that with human and machine we have 100% accuracy? Or where does that decrease that accuracy to?
One of the benefits of having human oversight as a part of the system is that egregious errors of the type that we were just discussing can be fished out and noticed for the errors that they are before being acted upon. So I think for that reason, it's important to have a human safeguard. But the fact that human face recognition is not infallible also means that we should expect humans to introduce errors to the system if they're given the final decision. And that's the result of cognitive biases that we all carry with us. And I'm talking about good faith errors rather than prejudice or malicious intent.
Okay, and you've written in Two Factors of Face Recognition, you wrote that face recognition accuracy depends much more on whether you know the person's face than whether you share the same race. How does this trend carry through into AI-based facial recognition software?
Well, I think it's important to distinguish between differences in ability and prejudice. Both exist, but they're independent of each other. And differences in ability to recognize faces reflect the viewer's social diet of faces, that is the range of facial appearances that they encounter. And that's important for at least two reasons. First, we should expect demographic disparities in face recognition by humans, even in the absence of prejudice. And second, the notion of a social diet of faces has a clear analog in face recognition technology, specifically the composition of face databases that are used to train the algorithm. So tackling prejudice is clearly important in its own right, but it would not eliminate demographic disparities in face recognition accuracy. That's a separate problem.
Okay, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll let my 14 seconds go.
Thank you. And with that, then go to Mr. Fergus for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank all the witnesses for being present here today. I do appreciate it. I'm going to have questions for several witnesses, so I was appreciate if the witnesses could be brief yet pithy in their comments. Mr. Jenkins, just in a question that you had to my colleague, Mr. Williams, you were asked a question about, which essentially was really setting up fingerprinting versus facial verification. From what I heard from Dr. Wang and from you and from other witnesses, they're not quite the same thing. So can you actually compare the two in terms of their accuracy? In terms of how facial verification is used or facial recognition technology is used as opposed to fingerprinting, which I'm assuming is just really a process of trying to match up a data set to another data set. Is that correct?
I think there are some general similarities. In both cases, the idea is to take a sample from the world, be it somebody's fingerprint live or their facial image live, and compare it with some stored representation that you have and that you're expecting will provide a match. The difficulty arises when the variability in the live capture from the person you're trying to identify can vary over time. And so you always have to account for that variability in attempting the match to the gallery of stored information.
So in other words, the situation changes remarkably for the presentation of one's face as opposed to a presentation of one's fingerprints. So it might not be quite an apples to apples, oranges to oranges type of comparison.
I think that's fair to say. And we know for sure that different pictures of one person's face can be more varied than pictures of different people's faces. So that's the nub of the problem.
Thank you very much for that. Dr. Wang, thank you very much for your presentation. And as well, if I may suggest, I know that you had only brought towards our committee a couple of the problems that your research has identified. If there are others that you would like to share with this committee, we have a common saying here, if we don't hear it or if we don't read it, we can't report on it. So we would certainly appreciate if you felt that you had the time to send us more examples of what you consider some of the limitations of facial verification. I'd like to go back to the two big problems that you had identified, brittleness and interpretability. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the brittleness of it, that bad actors certainly could circumvent the system, but also I guess the vulnerability of people who have no intention of circumventing it, but yet being victims of the biases. Because I think you talked about machine learning. All it does is just accentuate the biases that would exist in society in general. Am I correct?
Thank you. Yes. So for brittleness, because we don't really know what the model is picking up on in order to make certain identifications, we don't know what patterns it's relying on. So because humans might know that people are likely to wear makeup and put on glasses, they can control for these kinds of changes. But if someone were to inadvertently do something a little bit different with the face and how they're presenting, then this might not be tested for, and the model might just misidentify them.
Could I also ask you, and I know this goes beyond what you had testified today, but in some of the readings which we've had, we've talked about the limitations of the actual technology of camera technology, for example, that there are clear biases in terms of the faces that the technology will favor. It was created, throughout and evolved, since we started taking pictures, that it favors white males in particular, and for every other category of group, varying levels of greater and greater misrepresent or inaccuracy. I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about that. Even if we were to try to correct for machine learning, that we still have a problem with the actual technology itself and the biases that might be introduced by that technology.
Yeah. So cameras, ever since they were first invented, have pretty much always worked a lot worse on people of darker skin tones, and they just haven't accounted for different lighting differences. And the cameras have always been developed primarily on people of lighter skin tones. So a lot of times in different lighting conditions, it just will not work as well on people of different skin tones, and people's faces may blend into the background more depending on what they look like.
And as a result, therefore, it just perpetuates that bias that's already built into the system.
Yeah, exactly. The image quality will just be different for different people.
Mr. Canna and Dr. Watkins, I'm coming up close to the end of my time, but I'm going to see if I can get a really quick question in there. If I'm going to go to Mr. Canna, if I could talk about, you did mention that politicians have to get ahead of the game. Can you give us in very brief time how we should get ahead of the game to try to put the right type of framework around FRT?
Yes, I think you should use a technique called scenario planning. And I think for the purposes that you're using, the Oxford scenario planning approach out of Oxford University is quite useful because it involves multi-stakeholder engagement.
Dr. Canna, that was it was good that you did get a clear answer. If you have additional information you'd like to provide the committee, I welcome you to do so. But Mr. Fergus actually took his clock down to 0 before he was finished asking his question.
I'm always pushing the envelope.
Yes, indeed you are. With that, we'll go to Monsieur Vilmieux pour 6 minutes.
Bonjour à tous les témoins.
Hello to all the witnesses. Thank you for being with us today. I will focus my first rounds of questions for Dr. Canet and Dr. Jenkins. So to those two witnesses, in that order, I have a very general question for you. If you can respond in a few seconds, that would be great, and we'll go more in depth after. Does facial recognition mean the end of individual freedom?
So I'll take that very briefly. It depends. The contextual environment of governance of the technologies, but I think also the nature of the government within which these technologies are being employed is very important. So the legislative governance and other oversight mechanisms, and that can change. I think in certain contexts and certain kinds of government, it could very well potentially mean that.
Merci beaucoup. Dr.
Thank you very much. Dr. Jenkins, yes or no answer. Is this the end of individual freedom?
You really want a yes or no?
Autant que possible.
As much as possible.
Not on its own. No.
Okay. D'accord.
Perfect. Thank you. Dr. Jenkins, you talked about the variability within person variability. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Yes. Well, I mean, each of us has one face, which has its own appearance, but that appearance changes a lot over time, not only over the long term as we grow and age, but also from moment to moment as our viewpoint changes, as the lighting around us changes, as we change our facial expression or talk. And so there's an awful lot of variation. And this is a problem, because what you're trying to do, of course, in the context of face recognition is establish which of the people you know or have stored in some database are you looking at right now. And that variability is difficult to overcome because you're always in the position of not knowing whether the image that you have before you is, could that count as one of the people that you know, or is it somebody new? So I think the variability is really fundamental here to the problem that we're discussing, because different people vary in their appearance, but each person also varies in their appearance, and separating those two sources of variability to understand what you're looking at is computationally difficult.
Merci beaucoup. Dr. Canna.
Thank you very much. Dr. Canna, in previous discussions, you talked about biometric terrorism. Can you tell us more about that?
I'm trying to recall that particular conversation you're referring to. But certainly there are scenarios within which those kinds of questions are being explored. The extent to which someone's identity could be stolen to identify them as a terrorist actor. So there are many plausible scenarios. I'm not sure how facial recognition technology might play into that specifically. But this is where scenario planning and those sorts of techniques can be very useful to draw in the kinds of lines of inquiry that you're concerned about.
Et selon vous,
And what kind of government framework could we examine? Could you tell us a bit more about that?
I think the frameworks can only emerge from the kinds of study that this committee is doing already, and there may be studies in parallel that are occurring that you need to draw upon to look at these challenges more holistically. I think that's what I would ask. Facial recognition technology is embedded in a whole bunch of other technologies, and is to accelerate development requires machine learning, computer vision, a whole bunch of other sorts of areas, and so it needs to be looked at quite holistically in order for Parliament to develop that kind of holistic framework that's needed, I believe.
Merci beaucoup. Dr. Jenkins?
Thank you. Dr. Jenkins, because of the speed of development of technology, is it too late to act?
No, I don't think it's too late to act. I think it's important that we act now. And we should proceed on the basis of evidence and what we know, and use that evidence to try to accomplish what we want.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I will leave my last 30 seconds to my colleagues.
Thank you. Appreciated. And we move now to Mr. Green for 6 minutes.
Mr. Chair, I'll happily take those 30 seconds as offered. Mr. Chair, I think we can all agree that the technical aspects of this committee, I'm remiss to say that I'm not sure we're going to get as deep as we need to go in order to get the kind of report that's going to be required out of this in the time that we have allotted. So I'm going to put some very concise questions to all of the witnesses, starting with Dr. Watkins. Dr. Watkins, based on your subject matter expertise, what would be your top legislative recommendations to this committee, notwithstanding the fact that we're going to be putting together a report and hope to have some of these recommendations reflected back to the House for the government's consideration?
Thank you so much. I would say that I have 3 top recommendations. The top would be to establish a moratorium. It's simply too unreliable for the futures and the livelihoods to which we're allocating responsibility. The second 2 recommendations would involve accountability and transparency. We need better insight into how these tools are being used, where the data is being stored, how decisions are being made with them, whether or not humans are involved, how these decisions are embedded within larger bureaucratic organizational structures around how decisions are being made. So some kind of documentation to give us insights into these processes, such as algorithmic impact assessments, would be very useful. And further, some kinds of regulatory intervention to produce accountability and build the kinds of relationships between the government, private actors, and the public interest, so that the relationships can be built to ensure that the needs of the most vulnerable are addressed.
Ms. Wang, your top legislative recommendations to this committee for consideration?
I don't think I have anything else to add to what Dr. Watkins said.
Okay. Professor Khanna, your recommendations to this committee?
I think that the safeguards need to be increased, certainly for children, marginalized groups, First Nations. In particular, COVID, the pandemic has made things worse for all of those populations, and it's important to consider what the trajectory is in order to figure out what kinds of harms that are plausible to occur in the years to come, given the shocks we've already experienced.
And what kind of safeguards would you recommend? Do you have any specificity around that?
No, I would need to take some time to think about where specifically the strengthenings could occur. But there's some reports, for instance, the UNICEF policy guidance on AI for children of November 2021 that could be very valuable in this context.
I would put to all witnesses that should you come up with after this some thoughts that you weren't able to articulate in the fast fire rounds that we have, that you consider providing them to this committee for consideration in writing and hopefully to be also included in our reports. Professor Jenkins, your top legislative recommendations for this committee's consideration.
I would say attention to human operators in the design and implementation of face recognition systems, transparency, and the development of an expert workforce in facial recognition.
Okay, thank you very much. To Professor Watkins, I noted that in a report called Now You See Me, Advancing Data Protection and Privacy for Law, Danish Liberal Deputy Karen Michler said during parliamentary debates that predictive profiling, AI risk assessment, and automated decision-making systems are weapons of mass destruction because they are dangerous to our democracy as nuclear bombs are for living creatures in life. Given that kind of framing of weapons of mass destruction, you noted that there's going to be an important accountability in the private sector. I note that Amazon just had its first unionization. Hopefully there's some discussions around this. What safeguards should we be putting on the private sector to ensure that these weapons of mass destruction are not unleashed on the working class?
That's a fantastic question. The private sector often goes underregulated when it comes to these sorts of technologies. There's a really fascinating model available in the state of Illinois with their Biometric Information Privacy Act. And they established that rather than a notice and consent form where users have to opt out of their information being used, it's actually the reverse, where users have to actually opt in and users have to be consulted before any kind of biometric information is used. And biometric information is identified or defined rather quite widely in that legislation. As far as I can recall, it's including facial imprints as well as voice imprints. And this legislation has been used to wage lawsuits against companies in the private sector, for example, Facebook, for using facial recognition in their photo identification processes. And so looking at that kind of legislation that places control over biometric information back in the hands of users from the get-go would be very advantageous to taking steps toward putting guardrails around the private sector.
In close, in one of your papers, you wrote, or your colleagues wrote, that despite many promises that algorithmic systems can remove old bigotries of biased human judgment, there are now ample evidence that algorithmic systems exert power precisely along those familiar vectors. Can you comment on that statement?
Yes, thank you. While AI and machine learning and algorithmic technologies appear to be very futuristic and very innovative and brand new, they're based on data that has been gathered over years and decades, reflecting things like institutional biases and racism and sexism. And this data doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from these institutions that have engaged, for example, in over-policing certain communities. And processes like over-policing then produce data sets where it makes a criminal look a certain way, when we know that doesn't actually reflect reality. These are the institutional ways that they see populations. And so then those data sets are then the very data sets on which AI and machine learning learn, and they learn what the world is. So rather than being innovative and futuristic, AI and machine learning and algorithmic processes are actually very conservative and very old-fashioned, and they're perpetuating the biases that we as a society ought to figure out how to step forward and get past.
Thank you very much.
For there, and we'll go now to Mr. Couric for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and let me first make a quick comment. First, thank you to the witnesses for providing your expertise to the committee, and like a number of my colleagues have done. The way that these committee reports work is that only evidence presented can end up in the report. So if there is any further documentation, thoughts, evidence that you believe would be valuable for this committee to see, please feel free to send it our way. it becomes incredibly helpful as we compile reports, and that includes your recommendations. So let me make that offer to all of you beyond simply the questions that are asked here today. Just to follow up on a question that Mr. Green asked, to Dr. Khan, do you support a moratorium on FRT until there is a framework in place? Just a question on that.
On a personal level, absolutely.
Okay. I appreciate that, and the same question to Dr. Jenkins. Would you support a moratorium until there's a framework in place?
I'm not sure I have a strong view on the moratorium. I'm certainly attuned to the errors that can arise from these systems, and I tend to focus on those more so than the benefits, but it may not be my place to speak for the good people of Canada.
Okay, just asking for your perspective on that, but thank you. So I think this committee, both in this study and others, have heard a lot about the concept of consent, and certainly when you use facial recognition on an iPhone or Android or a computer, you're consenting for your picture to be used to log in and whatnot, and that is very, very different than widespread use, scraping of the internet for images, trying to law enforcement making a determination, and that's an important differentiation. So to Dr. Khanna, in 2016, it was reported that the federal government tested facial recognition technology on millions of travelers at Toronto's Pearson International Airport. So my question for you is this: what type of negative ramifications could there be for those several million travelers that passed through border control at Terminal 3 at Pearson between July and December 2016 when this pilot project was running? Could you outline what some of those concerns might be in a very real-world example?
I think part of the concern is that we don't know. There hasn't been transparency about what some of the implications and knock-on impacts may have been, and if there were, they may be even not clear to those who may have suffered harms that they are unaware of. So it's a very tricky and challenging space to get into, which is part of the reason why transparency is such a threat to people who sometimes circumvent the law in order to gather and test what can happen through that sort of surveillance. So, I'll stop there before speculating further on that question. I just want to add very briefly that there is this question of that there's that song. I always feel like somebody's watching me. And Canadians can now be, not feel paranoid that they might be feeling that way.
Sure, and I think that's certainly one of the big challenges that exists. So to Dr. Jenkins, if I could, on that similar vein of questioning, there's about 45 seconds here, I think. Ethical concerns relating to a pilot project like I described at Pearson International Airport. Would you have any comments on that that you could share with the committee?
One of my concerns would be the possibility of misidentification that is then difficult to detect or undo. I think around 100,000 passengers per day travel through Heathrow Airport. So if we had an accuracy of 99% in that context, we'd be talking about 100 misidentifications per day, which soon adds up. That just doesn't seem sustainable to me.
And with that, I'll simply use the last few seconds of my time to say thank you, and again extend the offer. Please feel free to send further information to the committee as you think further about these very important issues. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Kirk, for keeping us on schedule. And with that, now Ms. Sachs for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses today. So I'm going to start with a pretty open-ended question, but I feel that there's reason to ask it. We've heard a lot about what's wrong with this technology and why it's bad. Is there anything that's good about it? Anyone willing to take a stab to start?
Well, we use automatic face recognition as a blanket term, but it can be used in many different applications. Someone mentioned, the convenience of unlocking a phone or accessing account details quickly, using them privately in that way, similar to a password, I think is a very different situation than using them for ambient surveillance at the scale of an entire nation.
Okay, so going on that with Dr. Watkins had mentioned the benefits of the one-to-one facial verification versus general facial recognition. So there is some advantage use to the technologies, but as Mr. Khanna had mentioned, as legislators, we have to think about how we're behind the ball here, and the curve is trending further ahead of us. But at the same time, is there a way that we can set up basic fundamental legislative guardrails at this point, whether they're anchored in privacy or in preventing scraping from open source platforms, that could kind of create a safety net to start as we're constantly going to be dealing with novel and emerging technologies, but are there key principles that we can look at in guardrail legislation that we should be considering? If there's suggestions from Mr. Khanna or Dr. Watkins.
I'm just pausing for a brief moment. I think that there may have been other witnesses that wanted to answer your first open question.
I apologize.
So
Thank you.
What I might do is your second question you sort of addressed to Mr. Khanna. I'll let him go in now, and if perhaps Dr. Watkins wants to also go after, then and maybe answer either question, let's do that. So go ahead, Mr. Khanna.
Mr. Chair, my response is that I think there could be something akin to this is not the right phrasing, but a digital charter of rights for Canadians that allows them to own and have a portable and secure form of biometric data that's considered to be sort of sacrosanct. And I know that's a bit ambitious as a thought, but it's something that comes to mind as we have this conversation. Thank you.
Dr. Watkins?
Thank you so much for asking this question. This is such an important question that I've been having recently with colleagues. When I beat the drum about we need to get rid of facial verification, then a lot of people say, okay, well then what next? Then what instead? Because these systems are often in place to guarantee worker privacy, to prevent fraud, to protect security, and workers deserve to be safe and secure and to be protected from bad actors. But there need to be alternatives in place. It needs to be so that facial recognition or verification is not the only way, but that if there are ways to give workers other options, that they can opt out of the verification process and opt in perhaps with a password or with a fingerprint. And again, algorithmic impact assessments, I think, would be a really great first step to start to shed light into some of these areas where we simply don't know the types of effects and impacts these technologies are having on communities across contexts, and some information gathering missions in the form of impact assessments in partnership between the private and public sectors to start to assess what these impacts and effects are would go a long way.
Thank you. And through you, Mr. Chair, one more open-ended question, because we hear a lot of talk about moratorium. And for me, my key question is, how do we implement a moratorium? My key concern is actually about the relationship between private and public enforcement, that there are contracts that are set up in third-party structures, that currently there's a loophole, and but how do we create what would be key guardrails in a moratorium, either to Dr. Watkins or Mr. Khanna or Mr. Jenkins, actually, Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you. One thing that struck me in reading all the language around bans that have erupted in the past few years, that's a great start. These bans typically, however, only address the way that these technologies are used by state-backed agencies, by police departments, for example, and they don't curtail the way that surveillance tools are used, for example, like in retail stores, or the ways that these types of data can be then sold to law enforcement, or the backdoors, exactly as you're saying, between public and private sharing of data that's been collected without consent and without knowledge. So some kinds of regulation or guardrails around how data is transferred between public and private would be a good step.
Okay.
Thank you. And with that, we
That's
now
my
move
time.
to Monsieur Villemure for 2.5 minutes.
2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. 2.5 minutes is a little bit shorter than what I had before. Dr. Watkins, I heard your presentation, and could we summarize it with the words, be careful?
It depends to whom you're addressing. Such care be taken. If the definition of care includes, for example, consultation with workers or consultation with labor interests or workers advocates I mean, I have not spoken to all workers in Canada and the US. I can't speak for all of them. I know that there are some workers who do advocate for facial recognition because they say they want their accounts to be secure and they want to be safe and they want writers to be safe. And these are all good goals. But
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
to whom it is addressed, I don't know.
Merci beaucoup. Dr.
Thank you. Dr. Canna, in the scenario planning that you mentioned earlier, what would be your ideal scenario for FRT development as it is now?
I think picking up on the comments of my fellow panelists, I think they've covered very good ground, and you've got sort of three geographies here, UK, US, and Canada, where these technologies have been employed and where a large number of lessons have been learned, particularly in the academic community that's drawing and teaching us a great deal about what we need to sort of safeguard, and they're doing so independently. So I think drawing on those things is critical. And in terms of scenarios, again, it's looking at these technologies as FRT in a broader context of AI, machine learning, and other technologies that feed into and that are part of and embedded in FRT. That's what governments sort of need to do, is to look at this holistic context of we're in a digital society and things are getting ahead of us, and how do we create those safeguards as our societies become, face greater social and economic inequities in the years ahead, in part just because of COVID and things leading up to it. Thank you.
2.5 minutes, Mr. Green.
Thank you. My final round will be questions to Ms. Wang. Ms. Wang, in your work, you examined the amplification of bias in machine learning systems. My fear is that this committee has spent a lot of time on facial recognition, but perhaps hasn't been able to fully grasp the impacts of AI and of machine learning. Could you briefly describe the concept of bias amplification in machine learning, and perhaps describe what some of the material consequences of bias amplification are and who tends to be most impacted?
Thank you. Yeah, so bias amplification refers to a notion of bias that is often thought of as just a correlation in the data. So this correlation could be between some particular demographic group and some concept that they're stereotypically related to. And because machine learning models are just trying to pick up on any patterns that are available in the data to learn, they frequently amplify these biases and will overpredict them whenever they are deployed.
Do you have any examples in law enforcement, for instance? We're hearing terms around predictive policing, and again, kind of a throwback to a Minority Report example. Would you care to comment on any research you may have found related to law enforcement's use of machine learning?
Sure, yeah. So in predictive policing, if communities of color and people and different neighborhoods have higher proportions of Black citizens may have higher levels of crime, then predictive policing models may overreport those communities in the future to be more likely to have crime, even if that is not true. And it will over-amplify this compared to the base rate of what this correlation actually is.
And so, to address this problem, you have a tool. What do you see as the main benefits of this tool, and who do you envision using this as a way to enable preemptive data analysis?
I don't think I'm sure what tool you're referring to, but I think that just measuring these kinds of correlations and being aware that even a model with very high accuracy that may not be itself amplifying biases might just be kind of creating the same biases that are in the data set. So even if a model is adding additional biases, the existing data set will already have these too.
Oh, thank you. For the record, I thought I saw your work attached to a revised tool, but maybe that was a mistake.
Yeah, that's referring to biases, I guess, in visual data sets.
Got it. Thank you so much. I appreciate the insight into that.
Now to Mr. Bazan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank our witnesses for their time and their expertise on this important study that we're undertaking. Just want to go around to all 4 witnesses and just ask them the question, kind of following on where Mr. Green was at, that when you take artificial intelligence and machine learning, tie that in with facial recognition, and then the possible application of that into our criminal justice system, will this significantly impede upon constitutional rights, our charter freedoms that we have here in Canada, as potentially being used under the criminal code? If I can start with Ms. Wang.
I'm sorry, I don't think I'm familiar enough.
Well, so, essentially, if FRT and AI is used as part of evidence in the conviction of individuals, would that present problems under our criminal code and under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms? Can we rely on FRT as, enough evidence to deal with, our criminal justice system and protect the rights of individuals?
I think that because you can acquire facial images without any sort of consent, and that there are so many errors and you don't really know why a model would make a particular decision, then that would go against certain rights.
Okay. Professor Watkins?
Yes, thank you. Forgive my ignorance with the Canadian Criminal Charter, but in the US we have a right to freedom of movement. And if facial recognition technology is collecting faces from people as they move through public space, then that means the decisions they make about which public spaces through which they move could be potentially chilled. Then the implementation of FRT into public surveillance would have a chilling effect on that particular right. And that's just one of many other examples.
Okay. Mr. Kahana?
I believe this is going to be a test that works its way through the courts. I mean, assuming FRT and machine learning algorithms are used to identify criminals and not, sort of just their social media postings and so on, as happened in Ottawa, then tests are going to need to happen against the charter, in my view, to develop some legal precedent around this, and certainly harms are plausible.
Okay. Mr. Jenkins?
If face recognition accuracy is low, then there are concerns about miscarriage of justice. If it's low for some people but high for others, there are concerns about equality. And if it's high for everybody, there are concerns about privacy. Those are all the options.
Okay. So I want to get back to the whole issue of as we're going through this and we're hearing loud and clear on the recommendations, accountability, transparency, putting in place a moratorium until we have actual legislation in place. And, and I guess I'll go to Mr. Khanna first. How do we bring forward as parliamentarians the proper safeguards to ensure that facial recognition is being used correctly, that bias is removed, that discrimination is eliminated or minimized at the very least, so that we can write both, in the criminal code, in the Privacy Act, in PEPIDA, the guardrails that we need to make sure that we're not relying overly heavily on facial recognition technology, keeping in mind that there's always going to be issues around public safety and national security.
I'll answer that. I think this parliamentary committee is taking steps in that direction by drawing on such a wide group of interprofessional and interdisciplinary experts. I think another thing that's sort of important here is for there to be opportunities for employees of companies that have the largest data sets that may be used to be compelled to provide evidence on how they're using these technologies as well in order to inform legislative approaches. It could be company employees that come out and are sort of whistleblowers and are able to report into these committees in some sort of way, but drawing on what people know within industry to equalize and create a proper symmetry between what you know as legislators and what companies know internally is probably very important.
Thank you. And now Ms. Hefner for 5 minutes.
Thank you to the witnesses for your time today. And through the chair, I want to take advantage of the fact that we have 3 different countries represented here. So starting with Mr. Jenkins, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about what sort of rules, or is the UK looking at any sort of rules or guardrails around AI? We've kind of talked about how a legislator should approach this before it gets too late. And I'm wondering what other countries are doing. Mr. Jenkins?
Yes, I'm sorry. That's probably not really in my area of expertise. I can speak to the cognitive science of face recognition, but I'm not an expert on the law or the policy.
So you don't know whether other countries are looking into some sort of guardrails or moratoriums or looking at the legislation around AI or facial recognition technology?
I know that they are, but I don't have a deep knowledge of those processes.
Maybe Ms. Wang or Ms. Watkins can weigh in from a U.S. perspective. Is there any legislation that's being looked at the U.S. side in the same way that we're looking here in Canada?
I'm also not familiar with these.
This is not my area of expertise, but I will say that one area of legislation that's been particularly useful for workers in automated decision-making is in the GDPR and its functional right to an explanation. While the GDPR does not actually have the words right to an explanation, a lot of the guardrails around ensuring that companies have to provide workers with insights into how decisions are being made about them by automated systems could be a really useful model.
Okay. So other than what we've heard, does anybody have any further advice on how as legislators, we can help make this practice if it comes, other than a moratorium, maybe more specifically what guardrails we could put into place to make sure that that the risks are mitigated somewhat? No? Nobody wants to tackle that?
Well, you know, I just re-up something I said earlier on drawing on as much research and insight as you possibly can on racialized minorities, First Nations, children, anyone who's more vulnerable to this sort of exploitation or could be made vulnerable by changing economic circumstances that you know, the government of the day is worried about, and that many that members of the various parties are concerned about. Looking prospectively at this to figure out how to safeguard those individuals is probably very important in the mix.
We've also heard today a lot about how the biases in AI come from the human biases that we have in our society because the machines are programmed by humans. And I'm wondering if this is universal, because I did see briefly one study that algorithms that were developed in Asia may not have the same discrimination problems that algorithms developed in North America have. Perhaps Ms. Wang, can you talk about that? Are there better ways to develop this technology so we can still get the benefits while mitigating some of the discrimination risks?
Thank you. Yeah, so I think that each model is developed in the context of the different society that is made by and the people. And so models developed in Asia also have lots of biases. They are just a different set of biases than models that have been developed by Canadians or Americans. And so, for example, a lot of object recognition tools have been shown that they are not as good at recognizing the same objects, for example, soap, from a different country than the country where the data set came from. So there are ways to get around this, but requires a lot of different people involved with different perspectives because there really is just no universal viewpoint. I think that there's never a way of getting rid of all of the biases in the model because biases itself are very relative to a particular societal context.
Okay, thank you. And that takes us to the end of the second block. We're going to go into subsequent rounds now. For the information of members, it does not appear that there will likely be a vote at this point, but so we will be able to probably complete this meeting. There'll be plenty of opportunity for members to get questions in. So with that, we go now to Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm going to follow my colleague, Ms. Hempner, on some of the questioning. Mr. Jenkins, again, you've written about the other race effect. Which is a theory that own race faces are better remembered than other race faces. Now, we know that facial recognition technology is very accurate with white faces, but its accuracy drops with other skin colors. Could this be due to the other race effect of the programmers, essentially a predominantly white programming team creating an AI which is better at recognizing white faces? And would the same bias apply to an FRT AI developed by a predominantly, let's say, black programming team? What is the research you've shown, and what are you seeing in your studies?
Bias among programmers could be a factor, but I don't think we need to invoke that to understand the demographic group differences that we see in these automatic face recognition systems. I think that can be explained by the distribution of images that are used to train the algorithms. If you feed the algorithms mostly, let's say, white faces, then it will be better at recognizing white faces than faces from other races. If you feed it mainly on black faces, it will be better at recognizing black faces than white faces. Maybe the analogy with language is helpful here. It matters what's in your environment as you are developing as a human, and it matters also as you're being programmed as an artificial system.
Okay. Ms. Wang, we know that facial recognition technology is terribly inaccurate with correctly identifying non-white peoples. We've heard of error rates up to 34% for darker-skinned females. This FRT-induced digital racism is unacceptable and further reinforces why this technology should not be used for law enforcement. You've written about mitigating bias in machine learning. How do we end this digital racism?
I think it's very hard to think about because none of these technologies are ever going to be used in a vacuum, and they're always situated in a particular social context. And so even if you had some sort of facial recognition system that worked perfectly or at least the same across different people of different skin tones, the way that it is used, for example, in over surveillance or policing is itself still very racist. And you can never really disentangle the technology from its use case. Okay.
I want to follow on one of my colleagues' questions on can this technology be used for good? Something that I've read about is having this technology used to help curb human trafficking. So finding images, using AI to identify, let's say, an individual who might have been 13 when they disappeared and now are older. Using that technology for good may be used in human trafficking or solving some of that. Is there a way that use for good, and I'll ask this for all of our panelists, are there ways to have that used on a positive aspect from law enforcement and not the negative? Are there ways that we can really, that you can see right now that can be something that's protected into when we're looking at legislation?
think you characterized face recognition technology as a tool. And in my view, that's exactly the correct characterization. You can use a tool to try to help other people, and you can use it to try to harm other people. And so we need to understand the intent of people as well as understanding the capabilities of the technology itself.
Okay. Same question. Anyone else? We've got 40 seconds, and everyone else can answer that.
You know, I might add that, you know, consumer companies and consumer brands and retailers are, you know, looking quite closely at the technology and are advancing how they think about sentiment analysis and perceiving how customers are feeling in a branded or transactional environment. For some people, they might not find that particularly threatening. They might find it sort of you know, benefit in some way, but there still need to be guardrails around that. So there's always going to be some economic arguments for traffic, for sales, for different you know, kinds of marketing and sales and engagement and transactional opportunities that probably need to be looked at should these technologies be employed from an oversight standpoint.
Thank you. And now Mr. Baines for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for taking the time today. I wanted to just maybe leave an open question here for any of our witnesses. Based on your responses to Mr. Green's question earlier, there seems to be a considerable amount of legislation needed before FRT is widely used. And my questions are coming from Richmond, British Columbia, and it's a home to a strong South Asian and an Asian demographic. And we learned from an earlier panel expert that joined us who, quote, flagged that the VPD is using FRT without a lot of oversight. Are you aware of any in British Columbia or law enforcement agencies that are using FRT? Anybody? Maybe Mr. Khanna, if I could maybe go to you. Are you aware of any of this?
No, I'm not aware of how the Vancouver Police Department is using FRT.
Okay, and then maybe I'll stay with you then. In a paper, you and your colleagues acknowledge that machine learning systems perpetuate and amplify certain biases present in the data. As a result, you developed the REVISE tool to enable preemptive analysis of large-scale data sets. You know, how does the REVISE tool mitigate these biases?
I think this could be another Sanjay Khanna who happens to be working in AI and machine learning, but it's not me.
Oh, okay.
I think that is me. So what the REVISE tool mostly does is it tries to find different patterns and correlations present in the data set that are likely to propagate into a model that is trained on this data set, but is not guaranteed by any means to find all of the possible correlations that could arise. It just surfaces potential ones to the user so that they can be more aware, both in data set creation and when they are using a model that has been trained on such a data set.
Okay, thank you. And I would like to share the rest of my time with my colleague, Mr. Fergus.
Thank you very much. Mr. Baines, and I appreciate this. Just moving on a little bit, Dr. Wang, you had mentioned earlier in your testimony, and I just want to make sure that we got this right, is that even if we were to solve for bias and discrimination, you still pose that there are some concerns which have been brought into the use of machine learning in terms of identifying folks. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So two of the points that I brought up are interpretability and brittleness. And so for brittleness, back actors are able to just trick the model in different ways. And so the specific study that I'm referring to is they print a type of glasses, and on it there's like a particular pattern, and through this they can actually trick a model into thinking they're somebody completely different. And then the other part is transparency. And so models right now are very uninterpretable because they have been able to pick up on whatever patterns the model has figured out is able to help it best with its task, but we don't necessarily, as people, know what the patterns the model is relying on are. So it could be relying on
The machines aren't able to tell us, sorry to interrupt, in other words, the machines are not able to tell us what it is that they're using to make that kind of an evaluation. So in a sense,
exactly.
Right. Mr. Khanna, you talked and you'd raised the possibility of a digital charter of rights for Canadians. This is a very intriguing idea. What would you, if you were to blue sky a little bit, what would you expect that would be some of the elements inside that kind of a charter?
The sanctity of personal data, so protection of certain data that like facial data that's very intimate to the individual. I think that's part of it, but I think it would also aim to ensure alignment between the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and also be potentially a secure repository of data that can be exchanged and verified and is much more cyber secure than might be out.
Could I very quickly ask you, Dr. Khanna, Mr. Khanna, if you could talk about the sanctity of personal data? Did we just lose Mr. Khanna off the screen? Here we go. And you're on mute, sir. I just want to ask you, the sanctity of personal data, does that mean that we would have the right, for example, like our images and our facial images would be ours? It's our property. Has the horse left the barn on that? Or can we pull that back in?
I mean, I think the horse has left the barn to a great extent, and to the extent that you can't draw out of Clearview AI what's been already taken. But I think in starting to think about this, particularly as children age, we aren't the only ones who've been exposed to facial recognition technology. There are current and multiple generations that are going to be sort of affected by this. So thinking about those who haven't yet been exposed, for whom the horse hasn't left the barn, is super important.
Okay, thanks. We'll let you again go quite a bit over time there, but the testimony is good and important, and we're for once not quite jammed up against a hard stop here. So next is Monsieur Villemeux. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Dr. Jenkins. How could we insert some ethics into FRT? Would it be through radical transparency or the right to forget? I'll give you 2.5 minutes to tell us more.
Yes, I certainly think transparency is important. We should aim for the situation where members of the public can understand how these technologies are being used, how they could be effective, how they could be affected by them, and how they may have been affected by them. We know from studies of use of these technologies in the US, for example, that there's very little in terms of an audit trail. And I think auditing the use of face recognition technologies is going to be an important part of using them more widely.
Est-ce que le concept de transparence?
The concept of radical transparency is something that we talk about often. Is that enough, not applicable?
I think it's probably not enough on its own, but I think it's an important component of an ethical system.
Maintenant, une dernière.
And now a last question on consent. When we're walking on a street, our image is captured, we can't give consent. So if it's almost impossible, what can we expect for consent?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. I don't have a straight answer. I'm slightly cautious about comparing face recognition technologies against a perfectly accurate and bias-free system, because that's not an option that's on the table. And it's certainly not what we get from the kinds of decision systems that have been in use for decades. Current systems involve errors and involve bias, and we don't consent to being captured on, well, CCTV in my country or by the eyes of other people. So I think it's a complicated matter.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
And now, Mr. Green.
And just to clarify, it's 5 minutes?
No, it's 2.5 with a little generosity.
2.5 fire round.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Appreciate the generosity. We will go to Professor Khanna. Professor Khanna, I'm hoping to explore even deeper the relationship between corporate use of this technology and the state. So as I'm to understand, companies and organizations you have advised utilize FRT. What regulations and measures must these companies adhere to in order to protect data and privacy for Canadians currently?
So, just to clarify, I haven't advised companies on their use of FRT. It would be a bit of an accident if they happen to be using it, but the projects I've worked on haven't been FRT specific. A project I worked on recently with the World Congress on Justice with Children on the future of child justice.
If I could, with 2 minutes and 30 seconds,
Yeah.
You referenced guardrails.
Yeah.
So based on your experience, does Canada have an appropriate framework to regulate the use of facial recognition technology by private and state agencies?
Not yet. And that's, I think that's what I'm hoping that you and other legislators will get your fine minds around.
Okay. Professor Jenkins, given the challenges of accurate facial recognition, both by humans and artificial intelligence, immediately, not immediately, but I would say like coming out of this study, do you have any further recommendations to mitigate the negative consequences of relying on facial recognition for security purposes specifically?
One of the main concerns is mistaken identity, and just the idea that an innocent person could be apprehended, accused, even sentenced for a crime they didn't commit. That's clearly an error that we want to avoid, and we also want to avoid the opposite error of failing to apprehend someone who could be a great danger to other people. That's not new. I mean, we've been trying to mitigate those problems ever since we've had eyewitness testimony, but it takes on a new form at the scale that face recognition technologies are being deployed.
Well, one
to
of
my
the
mind,
ways
that's the main difference.
Yeah, and I know Ms. Wang brought up the point of interpretability and the idea that with humans, at least, you can contest a decision. But as it stands now, there's a difficulty in contesting decisions that are being made. Do you have any input on ways in which we can mitigate interpretability and the spurious ways in which we can contest decisions?
It's possible to ask a human how they reached a particular judgment, but we actually don't have a great deal of insight into why we make the decisions that we make sometimes. And often we're inventing justifications post hoc that sound plausible to others, and that's news to us as much as it is to them. So I'm not sure I can make recommendations that would transfer readily from that situation to decisions made by AI.
Okay.
But you would agree that...
Thank you. I did give you an extra minute, more or less there, and I'll at this now we'll have Mr. Bazan for up to 5 and or a share if you're going to go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to direct my questions towards Professor Watkins. You talked about the whole issue of putting in place a moratorium on the use of FRT until we have the proper guardrails in place through legislation and regulation. When is it appropriate to use FRT? In the workplace, by government agencies, by individuals?
Thank you. I would say a step towards answering that question would be to use such legislative and regulatory tools as, again, an algorithmic impact assessment in tandem with consultation with marginalized groups. I can't speak for the workers as to what kinds of safety and security technologies that they would like to see in their workplaces. And so consulting with these groups to ask them what kinds of technology that they are okay with and that they would prefer to comply with, and again, providing them with alternatives where they can opt out of technologies that they do not wish to comply with, but yet still access their means of livelihood would be good steps.
Do you believe that police and agencies should be allowed to use FRT?
No.
So not just a moratorium, you're talking about a complete ban of using FRT by police agencies, border service agencies, the government in general?
In high-risk scenarios where lives and livelihood are on the line, these technologies are simply not only are they at present unreliable, but they also presume that social constructs like race and gender are machine readable in a person's face, which is simply untrue.
So when you start talking about companies like Clearview AI, who have a track record of being mistakenly identifying people and having a prejudice in their AI technology with FRT, should those companies be banned?
I think that their technologies should not be used in high-risk scenarios.
So they would be still, in your mind, okay to use by an employer in the workplace, even though they got a track record that definitely indicates a prejudice?
I think the workplace is a very high-risk scenario. They should not be used in the workplace. They should not be used in public space. They should not be used by police. Frankly, I think there ought to be a moratorium until we know more about how these tools are impacting communities.
Ms. Wang, would you like to weigh in on this, since you've done extensive studying on how FRT and Clearview in particular has been used to marginalize people? Do you agree with what Professor Watkins has been saying here?
Yes, I do. I think we just understand too little right now, and we shouldn't deploy them yet, or if ever.
Okay, because you've looked at the RCMP, I believe. So would Canada Border Service agencies then, we'd often have national security threats. It's probably best, in your opinion, then, that we should not be using FRT in any of our law enforcement agencies, border control agencies here in Canada?
Yeah.
Okay. How much time I got? You want to take that last minute?
Sure. Thank you very much. And I'm just going to throw it open to all the witnesses, and I'll go through one by one. If you could list off as quickly as possible examples of FRT, either public or private, just for the committee's reference, that'd be very, very helpful. So starting with Dr. Watkins.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question for me? It's examples of already deployed FRT?
Yes, just off the top of your head, if you have any examples for the committee to use as reference points of FRT that's in use.
As far as I know, FRT is currently being used on Uber drivers, on Amazon delivery drivers, on at-home healthcare workers who are required to log into their workplace using electronic visit verification. In terms of FRT instead of FVT, as far as I know, many police departments across the U.S. are using FVT, except for those cities where there have been bans or moratoriums, of which there are a handful.
Thank you, Dr. Wang.
The only ones I can think of right now to add are, I guess, iReview and some of these other kinds of interviewing platforms.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. Thank you, Dr. Jenkins.
It's often used in border control in a number of countries and in processes related to border control, such as passport renewal, to verify that the person submitting the document is who they claim to be. It's also used in retrospective review of crowd footage to try to identify suspects who may have been captured in CCTV footage, for example.
A question that invited a long answer from 4 members, so I am going to ask Mr. Canna to very, very quickly respond to your question if you would like, and then we're going to go directly to Ms. Khalid.
Okay, this would need to be confirmed, but there are stories of it being used in children's toys and children's applications and things like that. So that needs to be verified, but I've seen it. I recall seeing it in a UN report. Thanks.
Thank you. And for what I believe will be now our last round, or our last questioner, Ms. Khalid, go right ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and through you, thank you to the witnesses for your very compelling testimony today. Just to add to the list for all of your that you've provided, 2018, Taylor Swift used facial recognition technology to identify some of her stalkers. Very fascinating and interesting, and I think very complex use of technology. Now, I know that we've been talking about moratorium, so perhaps I'll start by asking our witnesses, what would a moratorium achieve in an environment where technology and innovation occurs at such a fast pace? Perhaps I'll start with Dr. Khanna.
Thanks. A moratorium, as you know, is really just it's a pause. It's to gather information and insight, both from within organizations, outside organizations, and to gather and assess, and then determine what kind of guardrails might be imposed should that moratorium be should it be lifted. If this is a question of math destruction, as Dr. Watkins has described, then it does make sense to employ a moratorium and create that pause for better decision making.
And how long do you think that pause should be until we come up? Is it for a perfect solution that we're looking for, or a workable balance between public safety, privacy, and convenience of the general public?
I would defer to my colleagues who've studied the developments in artificial intelligence and facial recognition technology more closely. Thank you.
If anyone of you wants to take on, please.
20 years ago, I used to go around telling everyone, well, the trouble with these face recognition systems is they don't work. And these days, I find myself spending more time saying, well, the trouble with these face recognition systems is they do work. Over the past 5 years, there's been an impressive progress in how well these systems can identify faces. Not to say that errors are not made. Errors are made, and sometimes they're surprising and difficult to predict. But it's absolutely right that the landscape is changing very quickly, and it would change through the duration of a moratorium.
Thank you. Just changing tracks a little bit, and I'm not sure who to address this question to, but do any of you know if there is current technology or a system that allows a Canadian to take themselves off of all facial recognition databases or artificial intelligence databases at all, or to be completely anonymized?
I suspect there are people on the panel who know more about the technology than I do, but if algorithms are trained on a huge set of images, and one of those images, or more than one, is of you, then the cake is already baked, right? It's difficult to unbake the cake and remove the influence of any one individual from the database on the algorithm that emerges from it.
Thanks for that. So basically, privacy laws and the protection of privacy laws in this instance are kind of that balance and not a black or white, as in you opt in or opt out. You're kind of there baked into that cake, as you said, Dr. Jenkins. So In that case, then, we see that social media companies, for example, or other platforms, they build in these algorithms, artificial intelligence that creates convenience of shopping. They purchase data sets for companies to buy their customers, basically, so that they can advertise to them. Are there any regulations that you think could be part of a potential Bill of Rights that would protect Canadians in the way that their data is sold to these companies? If anybody wants to take that on. Sorry, I just don't know who to address it to. It's a complex one.
Do you want to rephrase just really quickly and see if, or direct it to a specific witness?
Perhaps, Dr. Khanna, if you want to take it.
Yeah, I mean, this is where we don't really know how to protect Canadians in that way on the commercial side. I mean, that's why there's been discussion of data portability, where Canadians would have the right to their own data, but also to earn money from it should they consent to it being used transactionally. And there's been a lot of pushback against that. In Australia, News Corp was finally pushed by or Google had to pay publications for the data that they were using online, and that could be done, at least conceptually, for citizens as well.
Very much to all your witnesses. I'm going to actually, there's a couple of things I want to address from the chair here. First of all, just at the very end, Mr. Khanna, to your response to Mr. Kurick's question, you referenced a report that that talked about the use of FTR in with respect to children's toys. I wonder if you could supply that report, or give the information to our clerk so that report might be available to the committee for its report to Parliament.
Happy to do so.
Okay, that would be very appreciated. And I just want to ask about in the examples that have come about today, I guess the most benign, if that's the word for it, use of FTR, or one of the more benign uses that had been spoken of is the one that many of us are familiar with, the facial recognition to unlock an iPhone or a mobile device, and wherein an individual has consented to this use. They've supplied the photo of themselves for their convenience of and the security of biometric security around your own phone. On a personal level, I find a fingerprint much more convenient and easier if the device will allow that than a photo, and more reliable. But if this is one that there seems to be around on this panel or around the table to be one of the more easily supported uses of this, are there problems even at that level of where a consumer is readily, or at least relatively readily, consenting to this type of use? Is this maybe ask each of our panelists to maybe weigh in just for a quick moment on this? Like this, would this be an acceptable use of FTR? Would this be included in the moratoriums that some are asking for? I'll call them out since I can do that. I'll start with Dr. Watkins just for a quick answer.
Thank you so much. This is a great question. I think I might urge the committee to think about consent and the context in which consent takes place. Consent can often be much more complex than it looks from the outside. It's not always a yes or no I don't want to do this, so I'm going to go to the next alternative. Often there are no alternatives. Often there are financial pressures that people are facing in order to be forced to comply with these kinds of protocols. For example, the facial verification that's in place in many gig companies, there is no alternative. If they don't comply with facial verification, then they're simply off the app.
Dr. Jenkins.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think informed consent it goes a long way, but it has to be informed.
Mr. Canna?
The only thing I can add to my esteemed panelists here is another potentially benign use case, and they may contradict me on this, but I think one of them is using FRT to prevent industrial accidents. If there are operators who are tired or sleepy, this could include long-haul truckers, others, in nuclear or other kinds of, industrial facilities where, or in health, where falling asleep and that not being alert to one's lack of attention could be potentially beneficial.
And Ms. Wang for the final word.
Well, I think it's not always clear what your image is used for, so I don't know that phones these days do this, but they could be collecting that data and using it to train other models. Right. And so consent isn't always clear that it applies to all of these cases.
Indeed. Okay. Well, thank you all. Although, Mr. Fergus, go ahead. You've got your hand up there.
Can I just ask a follow-up question to yours? Because I thought that was a really interesting line of investigation that you're going on, and I just want to...
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Fergus. We've got a few moments left, so
well,
ahead.
Then, is this a situation, following up on Mr. Kelly's question in terms of the individual use and whether or not let's say there's consent on it and the use, is there any, when we use these facial recognition technologies to have access to our phones, are those images shared beyond the use of that phone and the owner of that phone? Or are fingerprints used, or is that information shared beyond? I thought that it was just really, I thought the consent on those kind of phones or security devices is that it was really between the end user and the phone itself. And please correct me if I'm wrong, because I'd like to know.
I think different companies have taken different positions on that. So for some companies, everything happens on the device. And for other companies, that's not a part of the deal. It can go to the cloud and from there to other places.
Any other of our witnesses would care to go ahead, Dr. Watkins?
Thank you. I agree with Dr. Jenkins, and I think the variance that he described, and also the lack of certainty that we have about whether the status stays on the phone or if it stays on company servers, or if in fact it's used by a third-party vendor and stored on their servers. This just shows the need for transparency that we ought to have into where this data is being stored and how it's being used.
Right. All right. Well, go ahead, Ms. Wang.
There's a new version of training called federated learning where you can keep the image on your device the entire time, but you still can send kind of an update. So you tell a model how it should adjust its parameters such that it can better classify your own image. And in this case, the image never leaves you or your phone, but the model is still able to use that information to improve itself. And I think it is a little bit ambiguous here, like how consent would work there.
All right. Well, thank you so much to our witnesses. Very informative panel. And with that, I will adjourn the meeting. Meeting adjourned.